The cave is almost pitch black. Somewhere near the entrance, sunlight cuts a thin blade across the stone floor, and outside that entrance stands an army of 3,000 men. Their king has walked into this exact cave, alone, unarmed, to relieve himself in what he thinks is an empty hole in the rock. He does not know that a fugitive is pressed against the wall only a few feet away, close enough to hear him breathe, close enough to reach out and end his life with one motion of a blade. That fugitive does not kill him. Instead, he reaches forward in the dark and cuts a small piece of fabric from the hem of the king's robe. Nothing more. The king walks out into the daylight, never knowing how close he came to death. That fugitive is a shepherd boy who once killed a lion with his bare hands, who once walked out into a valley to face a giant with nothing but a sling, and who will one day be called the greatest king his nation ever had. His name is David, and years before any of that happens, he is nothing but a hunted man hiding in a hole in the rock at En-Gedi. And somewhere in the middle of that darkness, this same man, over and over across his life, does something almost nobody expects from a warrior on the run. He writes, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Most people know that line from a funeral, printed in a program, read in a calm voice over a casket. Almost nobody reading it that way knows it may have come from a man who spent years sleeping on cold ground, eating raw grain in open fields, and looking over his shoulder at every sunrise because a king wanted him dead. David wrote roughly half of the entire book of Psalms. 73 poems in the Hebrew text carry his name directly in their heading, and the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament adds several more on top of that. Most people meet these poems exactly the way most people meet the Bible in general, scattered, quoted one verse at a time, lifted out of the specific night or battlefield or bedroom that produced them. You hear, "The Lord is my shepherd," without knowing this is a man who was once a literal shepherd, sleeping outside with sheep, fighting off predators with his hands. You hear, "Create in me a clean heart," without knowing exactly which sin that heart needed cleaning from. The Psalms get treated like scattered fridge magnets pulled out at random, when they are really something else entirely. The running record of one man's entire life, scrawled out in fields, in caves, on a throne, and finally at his own deathbed. Here is the idea driving everything you're about to hear. When you read David's Psalms in the order his life most likely produced them, you are not reading a random collection of ancient poetry. You are reading the closest thing the ancient world has left us to a diary, written by a boy who became a king, a warrior who became a murderer, a sinner who became a worshipper, and a father who became a grieving old man. You watch his faith get tested by wild animals, by a jealous king, by his own worst decision, and by his own son's rebellion. We are going to walk through the major psalms tied to David's life, from the fields where he watched sheep to the final words he ever spoke, in the order his story most likely unfolded, not the order they sit in your Bible today. And one honest note before we start. Scholars debate how many of these 73 psalms David personally composed versus dedicated to him, or written in his style by later poets. The same way historians debate the authorship of some New Testament letters. We will flag that debate honestly where it matters. But even with that debate on the table, the Psalms tied to specific moments in David's story give us something remarkable, a portrait of a human heart in nearly every condition it can be in. By the end, you will never hear these poems recited flatly again. One more quick note before we start walking through his life. If you ever open two different Bibles side by side, an English Protestant Bible and a Catholic or Eastern Orthodox one, and notice the psalm numbers do not always line up, that is not an error in either book. The ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, called the Septuagint, merged and split a handful of psalms differently than the Hebrew text did, which shifts the numbering by exactly one for a large stretch of the book. Psalm 23 in most English Bibles is Psalm 22 in that older Greek numbering. It is a small technical detail, but it is a genuinely helpful one to know before we start quoting chapter and verse. Let's start where David's story starts, not with a battle, with a field full of sheep. Long before any throne, any army, or any crown, David is the youngest of 8 sons in a shepherding family from Bethlehem, so overlooked by his own father, that when the prophet Samuel comes looking for Israel's next king, nobody even bothers calling David in from the fields at first. He spends his days and nights outside, watching animals that cannot watch themselves, in open country under a sky with no city lights to dim it. Scholars connect this season of David's life to Psalm 23, one of the most recited poems in the English language, and to Psalm 8, a psalm soaked in the imagery of open sky and small human significance. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. Psalm 23 verses 1 and 2. Here is the detail most casual readers miss entirely. David is not describing an abstract metaphor he invented in a study. He is describing his own literal job, applied upward. He knew exactly what it meant to lead an animal to water it could not find on its own, to walk ahead of a flock through a valley where wolves could be hiding, to use a wooden rod to fight off predators, and a staff to pull a wandering lamb back by the leg. When he writes, "Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me," Psalm 23:4, he is reaching for the two tools sitting in his own hand as a teenager and pointing them at God. The Hebrew word behind shepherd here is roh, the same word used for David's own profession, later described in 1 Samuel. He is not writing poetry about a job he heard of. He is writing theology out of muscle memory. Near Bethlehem itself, ancient sources and later Jewish tradition point to a watchtower area called Migdal Eder, literally the tower of the flock, associated with shepherds guarding sheep destined for sacrifice in Jerusalem. A small but evocative detail, suggesting the fields David grew up working in were not incidental countryside, but functionally connected to the religious life of Israel long before he ever picked up a sling. Psalm 8 carries a different kind of wonder from those same shepherding nights. When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars, which thou hast ordained, what is man, that thou art mindful of him? Psalm 8:3-4. Picture a teenager lying on his back in an open field with no city light for miles, staring up at a genuinely dark sky, the kind almost nobody alive today has ever actually seen. That is very likely the exact posture behind this poem. And notice what the psalm does not do. It does not answer the question of human smallness by making humanity smaller. It answers it by declaring that this same tiny human has been crowned with glory and honor and given authority over the works of God's hands. Psalm 8:6. A shepherd boy nobody in his own house thought to call in from the field is already, quietly, writing about being crowned. Not long after, the boy who wrote about crowns actually receives one, secretly, in his father's own house, when Samuel the prophet pours oil over his head, while his older brothers stand by, watching, confused. Nobody outside that room knows what just happened. David goes right back to the sheep the next morning as if nothing occurred. And then the armies of Israel and the Philistines line up on opposite hills above the valley of Elah, and out of the Philistine ranks walks a champion, over 9 feet tall by some ancient measurements, a giant named Goliath, mocking the entire army of Israel to send out one man to fight him. Archaeologists excavating a fortified site called Khirbet Qeiyafa, overlooking that very valley and dated to roughly the era of David's early reign, have uncovered a 2-gated fortress wall and one of the earliest known alphabetic inscriptions found in ancient Israel, a small but genuinely striking confirmation that this valley was not myth. It was a real, fortified, contested border between two real civilizations. Scholars connect Psalm 144 to this same season of David's life, as a warrior stepping onto a real battlefield for the first time. Blessed be the Lord my strength, which teacheth my hands to war, and my fingers to fight. Psalm 144:1. Here is what most listeners miss about that line. David does not credit his own hands. Long before he ever throws a stone, he is already crediting God for training the exact muscles he is about to use. Think of it like a soldier crediting his drill instructor mid-battle instead of his own instincts. The confidence is not self-made, and David seems to know that even as a teenager standing in front of a man 3 times his size. David kills Goliath with a sling and a stone, and his life changes overnight. He is brought into King Saul's court. becomes a celebrated commander, and eventually marries Saul's own daughter Michal, after paying an unusual bride price Saul had set, specifically hoping it would get David killed in the process. 100 Philistine foreskins as proof of battlefield victories. A request David not only fulfills but doubles, delivering 200 instead of 100, according to the account in 1 Samuel. For a while, everything looks like the quiet fulfillment of that secret anointing from years earlier. A shepherd boy now married into the very royal house that once ignored him. Then the women of Israel start singing a song in the streets after a military victory. Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. 1 Samuel 18:7. And something breaks inside King Saul that never fully heals. From that day forward, Saul watches David the way a man watches a rival, not a soldier. He throws a spear at him in his own house. He sends soldiers to David's home in the middle of the night with orders to kill him at first light. Scholars connect Psalm 59 directly to this exact moment, since its own heading literally states that it was written when Saul sent men to watch David's house in order to kill him. Deliver me from mine enemies. O my God, defend me from them that rise up against me. Psalm 59:1. David's own wife, Michal, helps him escape through a window that same night, and he becomes, from this point forward, a fugitive in his own country, hunted by the very king he had once served faithfully. Here is the detail that stops most readers cold. This is not a metaphorical enemy David is describing. Soldiers were standing outside his actual front door on actual orders from an actual king, waiting for sunrise to kill him in his own bed. Before David disappears fully into the wilderness, one relationship survives everything else falling apart around him. Jonathan, Saul's own son, and the man with every dynastic reason to see David as a threat to his own future throne, instead makes a formal covenant of loyalty with him, warns him repeatedly of his father's plans, and at one final secret meeting in a field, the two men weep together before Jonathan sends David away for what both of them seem to sense may be the last time they see each other freely. No psalm in the collection is tied directly to this friendship, but its presence matters for understanding everything that follows. David spends years being hunted by one member of Saul's family while remaining bound in genuine, costly loyalty to another, a detail that keeps the fugitive years from reading as a simple story of villain versus hero, and instead as a genuinely tangled family and political tragedy. Running with almost nothing, David flees first to the Philistine city of Gath, the exact hometown of the giant he had killed, which in hindsight looks like one of the more desperate decisions of his entire life. The servants of the Philistine king recognize him almost immediately, quoting that same street song back at him, and David realizes he has walked directly into enemy territory as the single most famous enemy soldier alive. Scholars connect Psalm 34 to what happens next, when David, terrified, pretends to be insane in front of the Philistine king, scratching at the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard, until the king, disgusted, has him thrown out rather than killed. I sought the Lord, and he heard me, and delivered me from all my fears. Psalm 34:4. What deserves attention in this psalm is what it does not do. It was written by a man who had just survived his own enemies by convincing them he was worthless, and instead of writing about his own cleverness, he writes an entire poem crediting God with the deliverance. The Hebrew word for fear used here, magar, could also describe a literal terror that grips the body. David is not writing a calm reflection here. He is writing as a man whose hands were probably still shaking from playing a madman in front of the very people he had reason to believe would execute him on sight. Interestingly, a handful of psalms elsewhere in the collection carry a heading referencing an instrument called the gittith, a word most scholars connect to Gath itself, possibly meaning an instrument or tune originally associated with that same Philistine city, a small linguistic echo of the very place that nearly ended David's life showing up later as nothing more threatening than a style of music. From Gath, David flees into the Judean hill country and hides in a cave near a place called Adullam, and slowly, word spreads that the fugitive future king is hiding out there. men in distress, men in debt, and men simply discontent with their lives begin gathering around him. Roughly 400 of them, according to the account in 1 Samuel, turning David from a lone fugitive into the reluctant leader of a small, ragged militia. Scholars connect Psalm 142 to this cave season directly, its heading stating plainly that David wrote it while he was in the cave. I cried unto the Lord with my voice. With my voice unto the Lord did I make my supplication. I poured out my complaint before him. Psalm 142, 1-2. Here is the detail worth sitting with. The Hebrew word behind complaint here, siach, does not describe a polite prayer request. It describes an unfiltered outpouring, closer to venting than petitioning. David is not managing his tone for an audience in this cave. He writes, "No man cared for my soul." Psalm 142:4. From inside a literal hole in a rock, surrounded by 400 men who had gathered specifically because they did care, which tells you something honest about how loneliness can survive even in a crowd. Psalm 57 is often placed in this same cave season as well, and it contains one of the most vivid images in the entire collection. David describing his own soul as being among lions and comparing his enemies' tongues to sharp swords, before landing on a chorus repeated twice. Be thou exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let thy glory be above all the earth. Psalm 57, 5-11. Even hiding in a hole in the ground, hunted, exhausted, surrounded by other men's desperation, David's poetry keeps reaching upward rather than only inward. Here is a small technical detail worth pausing on, since it comes up constantly across David's fugitive years specifically. Several of these psalms, including the one just quoted, carry an obscure Hebrew heading, mektam, a word that appears nowhere else in ordinary Hebrew, and whose exact meaning scholars still debate, some connecting it to a root meaning inscription or engraving, others to a word for atonement or covering. Or, you will also notice, scattered throughout nearly every psalm David wrote, a strange little word inserted mid-verse, selah, appearing 71 times across the entire book of Psalms, and nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible, except one other poetic book. Nobody today knows with total certainty what Selah instructed the original singers or musicians to do, though the leading theories suggest a pause, a musical interlude, or a moment for the congregation to reflect on what had just been sung. It is a small, honest reminder that some pieces of this 3,000-year-old puzzle are simply lost to us, no matter how much archaeology and language study manage to recover elsewhere. One story from these fugitive years captures the loyalty David inspired in the men around him better than almost any psalm does. At one point, hiding out with a Philistine garrison stationed near his own hometown, David says aloud, almost wistfully, that he wishes he could have water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem, and 3 of his mightiest warriors, without being ordered to, break through the enemy garrison specifically to draw that water and bring it back to him. When they return, David refuses to drink it, pouring it out on the ground instead as an offering to God, declaring that it was effectively the blood of men who had risked their lives to get it. It is a small scene, easy to miss in the middle of a longer military narrative, but it says something honest about the kind of leader David had become even in exile, a man other men were willing to risk everything for, and a man who apparently understood exactly how much that kind of loyalty actually costs. The running does not stop. At one point, the people of Ziph, living in the wilderness territory where David and his men are hiding, go to King Saul directly and offer to hand David over. Scholars connect Psalm 54 to that exact betrayal. Save me, O God, by thy name, and judge me by thy strength. For strangers are risen up against me, and oppressors seek after my soul. Psalm 54, 1-3. Here is what deserves attention in this psalm. These are not foreign enemies from another nation. The Ziphites were David's own countrymen, from territory near his own tribal homeland, and they chose to sell out a fellow Israelite to save their own position with the king. Betrayal by your own people carries a specific kind of sting, and David does not soften that sting in the poem. He names it directly as strangers rising up, using a word that in Hebrew can describe people who have made themselves foreign through their actions, even if they share your blood. Somewhere in this same stretch of years, exhausted, thirsty, and hiding out in genuinely barren country, David writes Psalm 63, its heading stating he composed it while in the wilderness of Judah. O God, thou art my God, early will I seek thee. My soul thirsteth for thee. My flesh longeth for thee in a dry and thirsty land, where no water is. Psalm 63 and 21. Here is the image worth pausing on. This is not a spiritualized metaphor pulled from a comfortable desk. David is describing an actual dry and thirsty land, because he is standing in one, likely genuinely low on water, genuinely exhausted. And instead of writing only about physical thirst, he redirects that exact physical sensation toward God. Think of it the way a person lost in a desert experiences thirst as the loudest sensation in their entire body. And imagine redirecting that same intensity toward a longing for God instead. That is the emotional engineering happening inside this single verse. Not every betrayal in these years comes from strangers or distant tribesmen. One of the darkest moments of this entire chapter of David's life involves a man named Doeg, an Edomite serving in Saul's court, who witnesses the priest Ahimelech unknowingly helping David during his flight, giving him bread and the sword of Goliath from the sanctuary. Doeg reports this to Saul, and in a fit of paranoid rage, Saul orders the execution of the entire priestly family at the town of Nob, 85 priests according to the account in 1 Samuel, along with the men, women, children, and even livestock of the town. Scholars connect Psalm 52 directly to this atrocity, its heading naming Doeg by name. Why boastest thou thyself in mischief, O mighty man? The goodness of God endureth continually. Psalm 52, 1. The uncomfortable layer beneath this particular psalm is easy to miss on a first read. David is not simply venting anger at a personal enemy. He watched or heard about immediately after the fact an entire town of priests slaughtered because of information Doeg passed along, information that existed only because those priests had shown David mercy. The guilt embedded in that chain of events never fully leaves David, and this psalm reads less like triumphant confidence and more like a man staring directly at the cost other people paid for his own survival. In fact, in the historical account itself, David says as much directly to the one priest's son, who survives the massacre and escapes to find him, admitting plainly that he had known Doeg was present that day and bore responsibility for what followed, and promising the young man protection from that point forward. Few moments in David's early life show his conscience as nakedly as this one, a future king openly owning a death toll he did not personally order, but knew he had, indirectly, set in motion. Years of running eventually end. King Saul dies in battle against the Philistines on Mount Gilboa, and after a period of civil conflict within Israel, David is finally anointed king over the entire nation. Scholars connect Psalm 18 to this turning point directly. Its heading stating it was written when the Lord delivered David from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul, and the same poem appears almost word for word in 2 Samuel chapter 22. Giving historians two separate textual witnesses to the exact same triumphant composition. I will love thee, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, and my fortress, and my deliverer. Psalm 18, 1-2. The imagery throughout this psalm is genuinely dramatic. Smoke rising from God's nostrils, God riding on a cherub, flying on the wings of the wind. The very foundations of the hills shaking, language borrowed from the language of ancient warfare, and storm poetry, to describe an actual rescue that David believed he had lived through. Here is the detail that stops readers cold once they notice it. This is the longest psalm attributed to David outside of the acrostic psalms, and it is essentially a war memoir turned into worship. Written by a man who spent years sleeping in caves, finally exhaling after the threat that defined his entire early adulthood is gone. As king, David does not simply rest on that deliverance. He leads Israel's armies into a series of campaigns that expand the kingdom's borders further than they had ever reached before, fighting coalitions from Aram Naharaim and Aram Zobah to the northeast, while his general Joab wins a separate, brutal victory over Edom to the south in the Valley of Salt. Scholars connect Psalm 60 directly to this stretch of military expansion, its own heading naming both campaigns specifically. O God, thou hast cast us off, thou hast scattered us, thou hast been displeased, O turn thyself to us again. Psalm 61. Here is what makes this psalm unusual compared to David's other victory poems. It does not open in triumph. It opens acknowledging an earlier setback, likely a costly early loss during this same extended campaign, before turning toward confidence only in its final lines. Through God we shall do valiantly, for he it is that shall tread down our enemies. Psalm 60:12. Even in a season of genuine territorial expansion, David's poetry refuses to pretend every battle along the way had gone smoothly. Not long after, David brings the sacred Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem with public celebration, and eventually plans to build a permanent temple for it, though that specific project will ultimately fall to his son Solomon instead. Scholars connect Psalm 30 to this season of dedication, its own heading calling it a psalm at the dedication of the house. I will extol thee, O Lord, for thou hast lifted me up, and hast not made my foes to rejoice over me. Psalm 31. The psalm contains one of the most quoted lines of comfort in the entire book. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. Psalm 35. A line that reads very differently once you remember it likely comes from a man who spent actual nights weeping in actual caves, hunted by an actual king, before ever reaching this actual morning. That same day of celebration was not entirely without conflict inside David's own household either. As David danced before the ark in the streets of Jerusalem with what the text describes as unrestrained joy, his wife Michal watched from a window and afterward confronted him with open contempt for humiliating himself in front of the servant girls, a moment recorded plainly in 2 Samuel that shows even David's greatest public triumph carried private cost inside his own marriage. Archaeologists working in the area known as the City of David in Jerusalem have proposed that a large stone structure uncovered there in the early 2000s may be the remains of a royal building from roughly this period, a claim that remains genuinely debated among scholars, some arguing it fits a 10th century royal residence and others dating it differently. What is not debated is that Jerusalem, a relatively minor hill town before David's reign, became the political and religious center it remains associated with today, largely because of decisions made in exactly this window of David's life. And then comes the chapter almost every reader of David's story wishes were not there. From the roof of his own palace, King David sees a woman named Bathsheba bathing, sends for her while her husband Uriah is away fighting in David's own army, and after she becomes pregnant, arranges for Uriah to be killed in battle to cover up the affair. The prophet Nathan confronts David directly with a parable about a rich man stealing a poor man's only lamb, and when David condemns the fictional rich man with genuine outrage, Nathan delivers one of the most devastating single sentences in the entire Old Testament: "Thou art the man." Here is a detail that sharpens the entire episode. Uriah, the husband David has killed to cover his own affair, is identified in the text as a Hittite, a foreigner serving loyally in Israel's own army. And in the narrative leading up to his death, he refuses even to go home and sleep with his own wife, while his fellow soldiers remain camped on the battlefield, choosing solidarity with his comrades over personal comfort, the exact loyalty David himself fails to show in this entire episode. Scholars connect Psalm 51 directly to this exact confrontation, its heading stating plainly that David wrote it after Nathan came to him, following his affair with Bathsheba. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness, according unto the multitude of thy tender mercies blot out my transgressions. Psalm 51:1. Here is a Hebrew word study worth pausing on. The word translated loving kindness here is chesed, a term that describes loyal, covenant-bound love, the kind a person owes because of a relationship rather than because it was earned. And David is explicitly asking to be treated according to that kind of love rather than according to what his actions actually deserved. He goes further, asking God to create in me a clean heart. Psalm 51:10, using the Hebrew verb bara, the exact same verb used in Genesis chapter 1, for God creating the universe out of nothing. David is not asking for a repair job on an existing heart. He is asking for something built from nothing, the same category of act God used to bring the world itself into being. The part of this psalm that tends to get skipped over is its ending. It becomes, by its final verses, a psalm about restoration. David asking to be given back the joy of thy salvation. Psalm 51:12. A joy he knows he personally forfeited through his own choices, not something taken from him unfairly by someone else. Scholars often pair Psalm 32 with Psalm 51 as its companion piece, written sometime after the initial confrontation, once some measure of relief has settled in. Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Psalm 32:1. David describes the physical toll of hiding his own guilt before Nathan's confrontation in strikingly bodily terms. My bones waxed old through my roaring all the day long, for day and night thy hand was heavy upon me. My moisture is turned into the drought of summer. Psalm 32:3-4. Think of it the way unspoken guilt can genuinely manifest as physical exhaustion, a tightness in the chest, an inability to sleep, long before a person ever says the truth out loud to anyone. David describes exactly that sensation, then describes the relief the instant he stopped hiding it. I acknowledged my sin unto thee, and mine iniquity have I not hid. I said, I will confess my transgressions unto the Lord, and thou forgavest the iniquity of my sin. Psalm 32:5. The Bathsheba affair carries lasting consequences inside David's own household for the rest of his life. But these two psalms together show a man who, whatever the damage he caused, did not spend the rest of his life pretending the damage away. Those consequences arrive in full force years later, when David's own son Absalom, after a slow accumulation of grievances against his father, organizes a rebellion, gathers support across the tribes of Israel, and forces David to flee his own capital city on foot, weeping, barefoot, and covering his head as he climbs the Mount of Olives out of Jerusalem. The grievance behind Absalom's rebellion had been building for years by this point. Absalom's own sister Tamar had been assaulted by their half-brother Amnon, and when David, despite his own fury at hearing of it, took no formal action against Amnon, Absalom eventually took vengeance into his own hands, had Amnon killed, and fled into exile for years before an uneasy reconciliation with his father, a reconciliation that never fully repaired the trust between them. Scholars connect Psalm 3 directly to the flight that eventually follows, its heading stating plainly that David wrote it while fleeing from his own son Absalom. Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. Many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. Psalm 3:1-2. Here is the detail that deserves real weight. This is not an enemy army or a jealous rival king chasing David this time. It is his own child, leading his own people against him, in the very city David had once wept with joy to finally rule from. And yet the psalm ends not in despair, but in something closer to exhausted trust. I laid me down and slept. I awaked, for the Lord sustained me. Psalm 3:5. A man being hunted by his own son manages, according to this poem, to actually fall asleep, which tells you something about where David's confidence had settled after decades of practice trusting God through exactly this kind of crisis. Absalom's rebellion eventually fails, and Absalom himself is killed against David's explicit order to spare him, sending the newly restored king into one of the rawest expressions of grief recorded anywhere in the Old Testament. O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son. 2 Samuel 18:33. Scholars often connect the tone, if not always the exact occasion, of a psalm like Psalm 143 to this general late period of David's life, a season marked by exhaustion, betrayal from within his own family, and advancing age. Hear my prayer, O Lord. Give ear to my supplications. In thy faithfulness answer me, and in thy righteousness. Psalm 143:1. The psalm contains a striking image of spiritual and emotional depletion. My spirit is overwhelmed within me. My heart within me is desolate. Psalm 143.4. Language that fits a man who has now buried a king, a beloved friend, a child, and years of his own reputation, and who is still, even at the end of all of it, choosing to keep praying rather than to stop. Late in David's reign, one final psalm carries his name directly in its heading, with no accompanying crisis attached at all, simply called a Psalm of Praise. And it is the very last psalm in the entire book of Psalms to bear David's name in its title. An acrostic poem in the original Hebrew, where each successive verse begins with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet, from Aleph to Tav, start to finish. I will extol thee, my God, O King, and I will bless thy name forever and ever. Psalm 145:1. Here is what deserves attention in this closing structure. A man who once wrote from a cave that no one cared for his soul, who once wrote from his own guilt asking to be recreated from nothing, who once wrote while fleeing his own son on foot, closes out his contributions to the book of Psalms with a poem that alphabetically, deliberately, exhaustively runs through every letter available to him in praise, as if his entire vocabulary, from A to Z, ultimately belonged to this one purpose. The psalm even contains a line David's own life had tested from every conceivable angle. The Lord is nigh unto all them that call upon him, to all that call upon him in truth. Psalm 145:18. And near the very end of his life, according to the historical books rather than the Psalter itself, David speaks one final piece of poetry recorded directly in Scripture, introduced with a formal, almost courtly phrase, "Now these be the last words of David." 2 Samuel 23:1. The Spirit of the Lord spake by me, and his word was in my tongue. 2 Samuel 23:2. He describes a righteous ruler as being like the light of morning, like the tender grass springing out of the earth after rain. 2 Samuel 23:4. A farmer's image from a man who began his entire life as a shepherd boy watching grass and animals long before he ever watched armies and thrones. Tradition holds that David died peacefully in old age, having reigned 40 years according to the biblical record, and was buried in the city that still bears his name today. Modern excavations in Jerusalem's City of David continue to search for physical confirmation of exactly where his tomb originally stood, while a separate and far less disputed piece of physical evidence already exists elsewhere. In 1993, archaeologists working at Tel Dan in northern Israel uncovered a broken basalt stone inscribed in ancient Aramaic by a foreign king boasting of victories over Israel's neighbors, and inside that inscription sits a phrase most scholars read as, "Be it David, house of David," dated to a century or more after David's own reign. For centuries, some skeptics had argued David himself was likely a legend with no independent historical footprint outside the Bible. That single broken stone, dug out of the dirt in 1993, became one of the most significant pieces of archaeological pushback against that theory. A foreign enemy king, writing in his own language for his own purposes, still bothering to name David's dynasty as something worth boasting about defeating. Some scholars have since proposed that a separate, badly weathered inscription on the earlier Moabite stone, discovered all the way back in 1868, may contain a similar reference to the House of David as well, though that particular reading remains far more contested than the Tel Dan discovery. Even setting that second, disputed stone aside, the Tel Dan inscription alone was enough to shift an entire academic conversation, moving David from a figure some scholars treated as purely literary toward a figure most historians now accept stood at the head of an actual, remembered royal line. If this is helping you hear these psalms the way you have never quite heard them before, take a moment and help this reach someone else who needs to hear David's story as one connected life instead of 150 scattered verses. Subscribe, leave a comment. Share this with someone who loves digging into Scripture the way we do here on Bible Talk Simplified. Look at the shape of this entire journey now that it is laid out in order. A shepherd boy writing about crowns before he ever wore one. A teenager crediting God for training his own hands right before facing a giant 3 times his size. A fugitive writing from a cave that no one cared for his soul, surrounded by 400 men who had gathered specifically Because they did. A hunted man writing about thirst in an actual desert while genuinely thirsty. A newly delivered king finally exhaling in the longest victory psalm he ever composed. A guilty man asking to be created new, rather than merely repaired. A grieving father falling asleep while his own son hunted him through the hills he once ruled from. And finally, an old king running through every letter of his own alphabet in praise, before speaking one last formal set of words and going quietly into the ground. Notice something about how David's faith actually moves across this timeline. It is never static. The boy who wrote confidently about green pastures becomes the man who writes honestly about no one caring for his soul, becomes the man who writes desperately about needing to be recreated from nothing, becomes the old king who writes exhaustedly about his own spirit being overwhelmed within him. If your own relationship with God has shifted shape more than once across your life, gotten quieter, angrier, more desperate, more grateful, David's own collection suggests that is not a sign of failing faith. It may be closer to the only honest kind there is. And maybe the detail that lingers longest after all of this is simply this. David was, at various points across this single life, a shepherd, a giant killer, a fugitive leader, a betrayed friend, a newly crowned king, an adulterer, a murderer by proxy, a grieving father, a hunted father, and finally, an old man reciting his last recorded words. Almost none of the psalms above were written from comfort. They were written from a cave, from a desert, from a rooftop of shame, from the side of a mountain path fleeing his own child. And these are precisely the words that outlasted the throne he once sat on, outlasted the kingdom that eventually split and fell, outlasted every enemy who ever hunted him through the hills of Judah. The cave at En-Gedi is still there today, carved into limestone above a spring that still runs. The throne is long gone. Saul's kingdom is long gone. And somehow, 3,000 years later, people still stand up at funerals and weddings and hospital bedsides all over the world and quietly say, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," without always knowing the shepherd who first wrote it down was, for years of his own life, running for his. One last thing worth carrying with you. David is never presented in his own psalms or in the historical books surrounding them as a flawless man given a flawless life. He is presented as a man who kept returning to the same God after every version of himself he became: the frightened teenager, the celebrated commander, the hunted fugitive, the reluctant militia leader, the triumphant king, the guilty adulterer, the grieving father, the exhausted old man. If the version of you today looks nothing like the version of you 5 years ago, David's own collection suggests that is not necessarily a story of drifting away. It may simply be what an honest, lived-out faith actually looks like across an entire lifetime. Shepherd's field to deathbed, with every true thing in between. If this opened up David's story for you in a way you had not expected, help us bring it to someone else. Subscribe to Bible Talk Simplified. Leave a comment telling us which psalm hit you hardest, and share this with someone who needs to see these ancient words as one real life instead of 150 scattered verses. God bless you, and we will see you in the next one.